Hey guys, Pockets here. So this is going to be the Feral basic rotation video. What this video is going to go over is all the basics that you need to know to pick up Feral and to play it well. What it's not going to tell you is it's not going to tell you every single little tip and trick and detail that you need to maximize your Feral Druid play to the absolute most ridiculous extent. A lot of that information is going to be in the next video. This one is just going to go over the basics that you need to perform well as a Feral Druid so you can step into a raid and be like, yeah, I'm pulling my weight. That's the goal of this video. With that in mind, it is going to be a little bit more than just do these things and do this, and you win the game. It's going to be on the more lengthy side, so just be aware of that. To start off, I'll go into a little intro about what you can expect from Feral as a spec as a player. A Feral is essentially a buff, debuff, maintenance spec, and what this means is you're going to have several abilities that you look to maintain throughout the encounter, and based on the remaining duration of their timers and the state of your resources like energy, combo points, and your upcoming cooldowns, you're going to look to make decisions based on that information to best maintain these debuffs throughout the entire encounter. Another thing to consider about Feral is that it is essentially a complex spec, which means the developers intend for it to be a little more complicated than some other specs, where you don't have a 4-button, I just press these things in a certain order sort of rotation. There is complicated decision making that occurs throughout the entire encounter, and what that means is it's probably going to take a little bit more attention from you as the player to pull the same or better numbers than some other specs that you could pick up. So hopefully that's something that you're interested in. Alright, so first I'm going to go over some golden rules of decision making in the Feral rotation process. Things that you can follow 99% of the time and come to the right conclusion about what you should do to handle the situation. Then I'm going to go over some term definition, like words like pandemic, refresh, and clip, things that you need to know, because otherwise you're going to be listening to me explaining the rotation and you're going to be like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. I guess that means I cast the bleed? And then I'm going to go over the different abilities you have as Feral, your generators, your finishers, and some other skills, what roles they serve individually, and how they interact with each other. And then I'm going to go over cooldowns and how you should use them, including trinkets and things like that. And then I'm going to go over talent usage, what changes in your rotation when you take certain talents. And then finally I'll go over openers with the 3 different level 100 talents. For the most part they're pretty similar, but there are some differences, so I'll go over each one. Alright, so I'm going to go over what I like to call the 4 golden rules of the Feral rotation. Essentially, these are guiding principles, things that you can use to determine, okay, I'm in this situation, can I do this, or should I handle it this way? Generally, you want to pick something that doesn't break any of these 4 golden rules, because if you do any of these things, you're losing DPS. Now, these are not universally true. Sometimes it is okay to break them, but for the most part, these are things that you want to follow. So, the first rule is don't waste energy. So you have 2 sources of energy as a Feral Druid for the most part. The first being your passive regen, of course. And essentially what that means is at the beginning of the fight you're going to dump your energy, and then for the entire rest of the fight, unless there's like a break in the combat where you just can't do anything, you're going to make sure that you never hit 100 energy. Of course, any energy that you have that regens when you're at 100 energy is just wasted damage potential right down the drain. You're never getting it back. And your second energy source is Tiger's Fury. I'll go into cat form here and bring up Tiger's Fury. So every 30 seconds you can get 60 energy. Now, similarly to the energy regen, you never want to waste this energy if at all possible. You always want to make sure you get the whole 60 energy, because if you're not getting the whole 60 energy, you're just throwing damage away. Pretty simple. So the second guiding principle, second golden rule, is don't waste combo points. Feral is essentially a cyclical rotation, similar to any other combo point class, or holy paladins who have holy power, or just paladins in general, or monks who have chi. You're going to start with no combo points, you're going to go to full combo points, you're going to spend them, and then you're going to do it again. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to get to 5 combo points and then cast generators, because then that combo point just goes nowhere and you're losing damage. Now, we do have a passive called Primal Fury that is going to give you an extra combo point when you crit with an attack, with a combo point generating attack. So Yes, sometimes you will waste combo points due to this, because you'll be at 4 combo points, you cast a generator, and then you get 2 combo points. Okay, well, you would just waste 1. That's fine. That's not what I'm talking about in this rule. Any other situation, though, you generally don't want to waste combo points. And the third rule, don't delay Tiger's Fury. So I talked about Tiger's Fury a little bit already. 30-second cooldown. In order to do the most possible DPS, in almost every situation, you want to be using this every 30 seconds on the dot. Now, of course, like I said, don't waste energy. So the key here is you need to be below 40 energy every time this comes off cooldown, so you can hit it instantly. And if you ever do anything where you're like, oh, well, if I do this, it's going to push back my Tiger's Fury, you probably don't want to do that. If you're like, I could pool here and cast this finisher and then Tiger's Fury, you don't want to do that. That's the third rule. The fourth rule, similar to the first one, is don't sit on Omen of Clarity. Omen of Clarity is essentially just the buff form of energy. Whenever your auto attacks hit, they have a chance to give you Omen of Clarity, which makes your next energy costing attack free. And if your Omen of Clarity procs and you don't use it, then another one can proc, and then boom, 40 energy, or however much you could have saved, just out the window. There we go, lost damage. Now that is going to happen sometimes. It isn't entirely preventable, because you can auto attack faster than you can use abilities, but for the most part, if an Omen of Clarity procs, you're going to want to spend it pretty much just instantly. So those are the 4 golden rules. Like I said, these are not universally true 100% of the time, but they are something to keep in mind. Okay, so next up is term definition. So like I said, we've got 3 terms: pandemic, refresh, and clip. They're all very related. So the first one is pandemic. So essentially, pandemic is a warlock passive from last expansion that they carried over into all dots and hots, and even some active buffs like Savage Roar. And basically what it says is that whenever you refresh a dot, or any of those things I mentioned, up to 30% of the base duration will roll over onto the new one. So if we look at Rake here, Rake lasts 15 seconds. What that means is, thanks to pandemic, if I cast a Rake and then I cast another Rake, then the new Rake is going to last 15 seconds plus up to 30% of the duration of Rake. So if it's 15 seconds and then I cast another one 1 second later, the new Rake is going to be 19.5 seconds, because that's 130% of the duration. If the Rake if I cast the Rake and it ticks down to 2 seconds, and then I cast another Rake, then the new Rake is going to be 17 seconds, because you didn't have the whole 30% to roll over, you only had that 2 seconds. This is something that's very important for maximum dot uptime as a Feral Druid, or as any dot class, really. If you're not taking advantage of this, if you don't know what pandemic is and you're just doing everything willy-nilly, then either your dot down uptimes are going to be awful, or you're going to be refreshing things way too often and wasting tons of damage in terms of, like, for a Feral Druid, you're wasting Ferocious Bite damage, or you're wasting Shred damage, or something. The second term is called refresh. Now this isn't a universal term like pandemic, but basically when I say refresh, what I mean is when you cast the skill again when the ability is in its pandemic window. So if I have a Rake up and it's at 4 seconds left and I cast another Rake, that's a refresh, because it was below 4.5 seconds, which is when the pandemic window starts for Rake. And then essentially what this means and why it's important is that if you refresh things as opposed to doing it earlier, then all the duration remaining is going to roll over, which means you're not wasting any damage potential. So then the inverse to this is what I like to call clipping. This is a term from way back in Wrath of the Lich King era, essentially, that's been kind of butchered because it's not really what it originally meant at all. But when I say clipping, what I mean is anything that isn't refreshing, essentially. So if the dot is on the target and you put a new dot on top of it and it's not its pandemic window, then that's a clip. And essentially what that means is you just wasted damage. So if it's a 15-second Rake and you let it tick down to 10 and then you put up another one, well, you just wasted 5.5 seconds of Rake. Now, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. There are situations where you can take advantage of this. But for this video, I'll just say that you generally, for the purposes of this video, you don't want to clip things because you're wasting damage potential. So I'll talk more about clipping in the next video, but that's what it is for now. So now let's talk about skills. Specifically, we're going to talk about generators first. So on the right here, you can see these are our 4 combo point generators. Of course, the last one is Moonfire, and that's only if you're using Lunar Inspiration talent. But I'll go over that, of course. So Shred is essentially your bread and butter skill. It is a generator that generates 1 combo point, just like all the rest of them, and does just direct damage. And Shred's role is essentially going to be any time that you're not using any of the other generators, you're going to want to Shred to get combo points. So pretty straightforward. It does more damage when stealth, which means it's going to do a lot more damage during incarnation. But that's Shred for you. It costs 40 energy. It's basically the standard. And then you've got Rake and Moonfire. Now Rake and Moonfire are both dots. Rake lasts 15 seconds and Moonfire lasts 14 seconds. Rake is a bleed, of course, which means it benefits from our mastery, increased bleed damage. And its pandemic threshold is 4.5 seconds. Now, obviously, that's 30% of 15 seconds, as I mentioned earlier. But what this means is, whenever you want to apply a Rake, and then whenever it gets down to 4.5 seconds, you're going to want to refresh it before it falls off to keep the uptime as high as possible. Now, of course, the reason you want to apply Rake is because Rake does a lot more damage over its whole duration than a single Shred. So this is essentially the core gameplay aspect of Feral Druid. You have high damage over time abilities that cost similar amounts of resources, and then lower damage direct abilities that you use to fill in between the dots applications. And then Moonfire is essentially the same thing as Rake, only it is a ranged 30 energy ability, and it doesn't benefit from Mastery or Savage Roar because it's not physical damage and it's not bleed damage. Since it's a 14-second duration and not a 15-second duration, its pandemic threshold is 4.2 seconds. I mean, if you refresh it at 4.5 seconds, that's really not a big deal. You're not wasting much time. But it is 4.2 seconds if that's something that you want to worry about, which you should. And it plays essentially the same as Rake. Now, Moonfire does do less damage over its duration, but since it's cheaper, depending on your haste or mastery level, it can be about the same damage per energy spent, which means it essentially falls in the exact same role that Rake is, which means you want to keep it up as much as possible, at least on a single target or on several targets, and generally you're going to try to keep Rake up before Moonfire just because Mastery procs can make Rake better, and if the target runs out of range, you can refresh Moonfire later, but you can't refresh Rake anymore. So they're very similar, but Rake generally takes precedence. Now the last generator is Swipe. Swipe, unlike what it was in, you could say, Cataclysm, you could say Mop, it is essentially a AoE combo point generator. It is not what I would call an AoE damage dealer. It does deal AoE damage, but that is not its role. Its role is a AoE substitute for Shred. So Shred gives you 1 combo point, and if it crits, it gives you 2 combo points. Swipe is the same thing. It gives you 1 combo point, and if it crits, it gives you 2 combo points. But it costs more energy and deals less damage. Now the key here is, thanks to the way Primal Fury works, you only have to crit with any part of the attack. So if you swipe and any direct hit from the swipe, not including multi-strikes of course, criticals any enemy that the swipe hits, then you get 2 combo points. And what this means is, at 3 targets and more, it's going to make Swipe a very good combo point generator. Obviously, the damage it does also increases the more targets it hits. That's pretty elementary, and that's another reason you want to use it at more targets. But like I said, Swipe's role is not to deal AoE damage, at least the way it is balanced currently. One note about this is, since Incarnation buffs Shred thanks to its increased damage from stealth, but it does not buff Swipe, essentially the threshold for when you want to swipe shifts when you're in Incarnation. So when you have Incarnation up, you don't want to swipe until there's 4 targets. Unlike when you don't have it up, it's only at 3 targets you'll start swiping. So that's essentially combo point generators. Let's step into finishers. So essentially, finisher decision making process is one of the key aspects of playing a Feral Druid. If you are not following the right sort of idea for what you want to spend your combo points on, then your damage is going to be pretty poor. So Feral has 3 finishers, the first being Rip. Rip is essentially your highest priority finisher, and you only ever want to apply it with 5 combo points. Now the reason that is because it always lasts 24 seconds, but it does more damage the more combo points you apply it with. So this is a lot different than if you're familiar with Rupture from a rogue, where it's actually the opposite. So the key with Rip is you always apply it with 5 combo points every time. And the catch with it being the highest priority, it is the highest priority, but Savage Roar increases your damage done by 40% while it's active. So you never want to apply a Rip when you don't have Savage Roar up, because then the Rip is going to do 40% less damage for its whole duration, and that is certainly not what you want. So you want to keep Savage Roar up as much as possible as well, but when you have Savage Roar up, if it comes between do I refresh Savage Roar or do I refresh Rip, the answer is pretty much always going to be you want to refresh Rip. And then finally, the last finisher is Ferocious Bite, which is our direct damage combo point dump, something that you'll use fairly frequently during your cooldowns and fairly infrequently outside of your cooldowns, because if you use it too much, your Rip uptime is going to go down the drain. Similar with your Savage Roar uptime, that can also go down the drain if you Ferocious Bite too much. So when you hit 5 combo points, your decision making process should be something like this. So let's say I'm at 5 combo points. I want to look at my Rip timer. First I want to look at my Savage Roar. Do I have Savage Roar up? You better, because it's pretty damn important. If you don't have Savage Roar up, you probably shouldn't have got 5 combo points in the first place. You should have cast Savage Roar before then, which is important. Savage Roar can be cast with any number of combo points, of course. The duration is based on the number of combo points, but the key here is you just want Savage Roar up. If you can cast it with 5 combo points, awesome, but you can cast it with any number of combo points just so that you can keep Savage Roar up. It isn't particularly advantageous to do it with 1 combo point or 5 combo points, or just keep it up with any number of combo points that you need to. So to go back to what I was saying, your decision-making process when you hit 5 combo points should be something like, okay, is Savage Roar up? Yes, awesome. Okay, so now I want to look at my Rip timer. So I look at my Rip timer and I see, is it below 7.2 seconds? 7.2 seconds is of course the pandemic threshold for Rip. And if it is below 7.2 seconds, then you refresh Rip. Pretty simple. If it's not below 7.2 seconds, you probably want to say, okay, can I wait and refresh it? And generally waiting is called pooling. You're pooling energy. And even if you can't refresh, even if you can refresh Savage Roar, or you can do something else, if you can wait and refresh Rip, a lot of time that's going to be more ideal, because like I said, Rip is your #1 priority. And this goes back to the golden rules of Feral decision making. So if you can wait to apply a finisher, that's awesome, you should, but you don't want to waste energy, you don't want to waste combo points, you don't want to sit on Omen of Clarity, and you don't want to push back Tiger's Fury. So if you're waiting to apply a finisher and Tiger's Fury is going to come off cooldown, you got to do something. You can't just sit there and pool and then do the finisher and then, oh, okay, well, we'll just Tiger's Fury now, because you could push back Tiger's Fury several seconds, and that is certainly not what you want to do. Similarly, you don't want to cap out energy, you don't want to waste combo, like you don't want to shred to keep from capping out energy. None of those things are what you want to do. So aside from that, if you can refresh Rip below 7.2 seconds, that's your #1 priority. If you can't wait and do it, then the next thing you want to look at is, can I refresh Savage Roar? Now, Savage Roar has a pandemic threshold of 12.6 seconds. Like I said, it also benefits from pandemic to make the rotation a little smoother. So that 12.6 second threshold only applies when you're at 5 combo points. If you're at fewer combo points, it is lower, proportional to the amount of combo points you have. But generally, the only time you're going to want to apply Savage Roar that isn't right when it's about to fall off is if you're at 5 combo points, because that's kind of like a preemptive thing. If you're not at 5 combo points and you need to refresh SR, you want to do it in the last couple seconds of Savage Roar, because Up until that point, you can try to shoot to get something else done instead. Savage Roar doesn't absolutely need to be refreshed with 5 combo points. So if you get to 5 combo points and your rip is good, and then you look at Savage Roar and it's below 12.6 seconds, then you can refresh Savage Roar. Similarly to the rip thing, if your Savage Roar is at 14 seconds or something, you can wait until it goes to 12.6 and then Savage Roar. That works too. If neither of these things are the case, if you can't refresh rip, you can't refresh Savage Roar, and you can't pull and refresh either of them, then that's when you want a Ferocious Bite. Pretty much universally that is true. Now, if you're in a particularly nasty situation, let's say your Savage Roar, you're about to cap out energy because you've been pooling, trying to get that refresh in. Your Savage Roar's at 14 seconds, your Rip's at 9 seconds. You're like, oh, what do I do? In that case, you have 2 options. You can either refresh Rip a little early, which you generally don't want to do, but in this extremely contrived situation, that's something that's acceptable. Or you can Ferocious Bite, and then what's going to happen is you're probably going to have a short Rip downtime. This can be worth it because the Ferocious Bite does a pretty fair amount of damage, and as long as you can get that Rip back up as soon as possible, and you don't have a downtime of more than a couple seconds, then you're okay. That's essentially what your decision-making process at 5 combo points is going to look like. Your first priority is Rip, second priority is Savage Roar, and your third priority is biting if you can't do either of those things. Alright, so now that we're done talking about finishers and generators, there's one more skill that needs to be mentioned, and this is Thrash. So essentially what Thrash does is it is an AoE bleed. It's basically like an AoE rake, only doesn't generate combo points, and it costs a little bit more energy. So Thrash's role is going to be anytime you have more than one target, you're going to want to try to keep this up as much as possible. Now at 2 targets, it's about equal priority keeping up rake. When you start getting to like 3, 4, 5, however many targets, Thrash is going to start getting more and more important, of course, because it's going to do more damage per cast. When you're at something like 8 targets, when you're in like an AoE situation, that's when Thrash is basically going to take priority over everything. Now, just like any other bleed, you don't want to apply it without Savage Roar up, of course. So you could say Savage Roar has a higher priority. But Thrash is going to take precedence over most things when you get to really high numbers of targets. So that's Thrash. It's pretty simple. So now I'm going to go into how to use your 100 talents and how to use your 60 talents. And by 60 talents I mean Incarnation, because the other 2 suck. So, I already explained how to use Lunar Inspiration. It is essentially a second rake. One thing that this means is, since it is essentially the same damage or lower than rake, you're not going to be able to apply it much in situations where there's so many targets, because you'll be able to apply rakes, and then you're not going to have the energy or time to keep up Moonfire. So that's something to keep in mind. It's a tricky talent to use because it sometimes in certain situations isn't going to get used even though you've got the talent. So that's Lunar Inspiration. Cause of Shrivala, there's not really much to be said about it. You can't cast damaging spells in form, of course, as it says in the tooltip. So it's essentially just the passive, no impact on your rotation whatsoever option. Now, I'll go over Incarnation first, and then I'll talk about Blood Talents. So, Incarnation has a couple quirks to it. So, like I've mentioned, it counts as being stealthed, and it also counts as being prowled. So, what that means is it's going to make your Shred deal more damage, have more critical strike chance, double the critical strike chance of what's listed on your character sheet, and your combo point generation is going to go way up. Another thing it does is, since it counts as stealth, your rake is going to deal 100% additional damage when used from Incarnation. And this is something that will persist for the whole duration of the rake. So if you apply a rake at the end of Incarnation, the whole rake is going to do 100% more damage, at least until you refresh it. So part of what this means is to use Incarnation to the most possible extent. When you use Incarnation, you're going to generally want to refresh Rake immediately afterwards to get that 100% additional damage on the Rake. It's like, oh, well, I can apply a second Rake on the same target, essentially. Why not? I mean, it's a no-brainer. And then you're going to want to keep that Rake up for the whole Incarnation, and then when it ends, if you can, refreshing it at the very end so you can get that extra, like, 15 to 19 seconds of Rake is great. So that's essentially the key with Incarnation. There's not much else to it. It's a pretty good talent for AoE situations because you can apply Rake to as many targets as you want, and it's going to do double damage on all the targets. So finally we're to Blood Talons. So Blood Talons is something that is simpler than it might seem. So essentially the idea with Blood Talons is when you cast a finisher, you're going to trigger Predatory Swiftness. 20% chance per combo point to get an instant in-form healing touch. So if you cast a 5-point finisher, you're going to get a 100% guaranteed Predatory Swiftness proc. And then you're going to want to use that proc to buff 2 of your next abilities by 30%. Now you don't get to choose what the abilities these are, aside from the fact that you get to choose when you cast the healing touch. So it's going to always be 2 consecutive abilities, and something to keep in mind. Essentially what you're going to want to do with Blood Talons is whenever you get a Predatory Swiftness proc, you want to wait until 4 combo points, and then you spend the Predatory Swiftness proc. So you cast the healing touch. And what that's going to allow you to do is you can spend 1 charge to get to 5 combo points. So oftentimes you're going to want to cast a Rake because Rake does more damage over Restoration than Shred. And it's okay to refresh a Rake or clip a Rake that is already applied to the target if you're going to apply a Blood Talons Rake. I should mention that. And then you're going to be at 5 combo points. You have 1 charge left, so that 1 charge goes on your finisher. Either Rip, which is the best, most ideal situation, or Ferocious Bite. Now what you don't want to do is you don't want to refresh your Rip with... If you can refresh a Rip, so below 7.2 seconds, then with the Blood Talons Rip, that's great. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to clip a Rip early before the 7.2 second mark just to get Blood Talons on it. That is not worth it. In that case, you want to consider looking at a Ferocious Bite, like I mentioned earlier. And of course, since you're not always going to go to 4 combo points, maybe you're at 3 combo points and you crit and you're at 5, then at that point you healing touch, you do the finisher first, and then you have the second charge as your first generator, or even in that case if you're in an AoE situation, you could put the charge on a Thrash or something like that. So that's essentially how you're going to use Blood Talons. Now there is one trick to this, and it's not a big trick because Predatory Swiftness lasts long enough now. It used to be shorter, but now it lasts long enough that this isn't really a big thing. But if you reach 5 combo points and you don't have anything compelling to spend your finisher on, if your Rip is fine, your Savage Roar is fine, you're looking to bite, you can wait until higher energy and then do your finisher, your bite, or even your Rip or your Savage Roar, as long as you're not causing a downtime. And what that's going to do is you're going to start the next combo point cycle with a lead on energy. And this will allow you to get to 4 combo points more easily before the buff runs out. Now, it's important to mention that you're not 100% of the time, you're not going to be able to make it to 4 combo points to spend that Predatory Swiftness the way you want to. And if that happens, then you just need to cast your Healing Touch whenever Predatory Swiftness is about to expire. And do the best you can with it. You can spend 1 charge on Rake, you can spend 1 charge on a Shred if you have to. Just make the best of what you got. But you're not going to be able to get to 4 combo points every single time. It's just not possible. And that's something I see a lot of people think, oh, I'm not doing it right because I can't get to 4 combo points every time. That's not how it is. So that's how you use Blood Talons. So now that we've got all the abilities out of the way, it's time to talk about cooldowns and how to use them. So as a Feral Druid, you've got 3 cooldowns. One is Incarnation, another is Tiger's Fury, as I've talked about before, and the third is Berserk. So Incarnation and Berserk, at 100 at least, you're always going to want to use them together. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. On a single target, you get half cost energy of skills, and your skills are dealing more damage thanks to Incarnation, mainly Shred. And this is going to allow you to stack the most possible amount of bursts, and that's the most effective way to use your cooldowns, is stacked. And then Tiger's Fury, I've explained pretty thoroughly, but I'll go over it again. So you're going to want to use this as close to every 30 seconds as possible to get the most bang for your buck out of it. And then, of course, when Berserk and Incarnation happen, you want a Tiger's Fury to happen during your Berserk or during your Incarnation to get that cooldown stacking effect. I'll talk about sequencing a little bit later when I talk about Opener, but the one thing I want to go over is what I like to call the universal rule of cooldowns. So What the universal rule of cooldowns says is that if you want to do the most effective usage of your cooldowns, you want to stack them as much as you possibly can within the fight's duration without losing usages. So if I'm doing a 30-second fight, I know I'm only going to get one Tiger's Fury. So you can plan, you can move that Tiger's Fury around anywhere you want. You're still going to get the same benefit from it, with the exception of how much you stack it with other cooldowns. So of course, I mean, you're going to do it at the beginning in a 30-second fight, but that's not the point of the example. So let's say you're doing Mythic Butcher. Mythic Butcher is a 4-minute encounter. You walk in the encounter, you know this encounter is going to last 4 minutes. So I can look at my Tiger's Fury and my Incarnation and my Berserk and even my Trinket, and I can say, okay, I know how many uses of each of these I'm going to get. I know I'm going to get 2 Incarnations, I know I'm going to get 2 Berserks, so I'm going to use them together, and I know I'm going to get 2 coins because I'm going to use one at the start, and then I can have a second one I can use anytime. So, of course, you're going to use all your cooldowns at the start, and then after that, you have to try to figure out the best way to arrange them to stack them up as much as possible. So on a 4-minute fight, that would mean, since your 3 minutes are going to come off 3 minutes into the fight, you need to save your second 2-minute cooldown, your Trinket, to go with those 3-minute cooldowns, so you're still going to get the same number of usages of the coin, but then the coin is stacked up with all the other stuff and makes it way more effective. Now, you can contrast that to Heroic or Normal Butcher, where it's a 5-minute encounter, and you're going to do things a little bit differently. Now, you're still going to get 2 Berserks and 2 Incarnations, but in a 5-minute encounter, you can get 3 lucky double-sided coin usages. So you're going to use 1 on pull, you use all your cooldowns on pull, and then 2 minutes in, you use your second coin instantly, and then at the 4-minute mark, your coin comes off again. You saved your Incarnation and your Berserk from the 3-minute mark. You did not use them right away, so that you could stack them on top of the coin at 4 minutes. So that way, you still have your 3 coin usages, you still have your 2 Berserk and Incarnation usages, but you've got 2 points in the fight where you've got everything stacked up and you're bursting as hard as possible. So that's the basic idea with how you want to use your cooldowns, and this really applies to any spec, any class, any cooldowns. That's why I call it the universal rule of cooldowns. So something to keep in mind, especially if you know ahead of time this fight is going to last this long. Now, of course, it gets a little bit more complicated when you have a phase that, you know, I can do, my cooldowns are more effective if I use them in this phase, or we need to burn through this phase even if I'm not going to get the most deeps out of it, or things like that. But, you know, just something to keep in mind. Alright, so enough of that theoretical mumbo jumbo, so let's see some actual action. So I'm going to talk about openers. So on the right here you'll see the opener that I recommend for Blood Talons. Now the opener with the other 2 talents is of course going to be a little different, since you don't need to cast Healing Touches, as you see in the list. But for Blood Talons, you're going to start out with your Healing Touch. That's before the combat starts, you cast Healing Touch. So you get your Blood Talons buff, and that allows you to do 30% more damage on your first 2 attacks for free, before the combat even starts. You know you've done more damage. And then, to get ready for the pull, you prowl, you go up to the boss, your tank's getting ready to pull, so you hit your pre-pot, and then you, as the tank pulls, you hit Rake, you cast Incarnation. While the Incarnation GCD is happening, you get ready to press your trinkets, so that you have those trinkets up for your initial shreds. So Incarnation GCD is done, you hit Trinket, you shred to 5 combo points, and then you Berserk and Tiger's Fury. You apply a Rip. That Rip is going to benefit from Tiger's Fury for the whole duration, and then you shred to 4 combo points, and then you cast your Healing Touch. You do the Blood Talons things I mentioned, so you get 4 combo points, you cast Healing Touch, and then you spend the first charge on Rape, the second charge on First Bite. And then the next combo point cycle, you're going to be able to bite again, and you're basically just going to go into your normal rotation. One thing that's worth mentioning is sometimes you can fit a 3rd bite in between having to refresh your first Rip. So when you're going to do that, it's going to depend on the situation. Typically, you're going to want to try this with Bloodlust up, because it's going to be a lot easier to pull this off, because once your Berserk fades, you're going to need that extra energy from Bloodlust to make sure you don't have a long Rip downtime. So if you have Bloodlust up, absolutely try to do this, especially once you start getting into raid gear. Obviously in dungeon gear, your crit's not that great, so it's not going to be quite as clean. But once you get to raid gear and you have almost a guaranteed chance to crit with shreds because of your trinket procs during Incarnation, then that's when you definitely want to do this. So with Lust Up, you're definitely going to be able to get that Ferocious Bite in. If you get poor crit RNG, you might have a short rip downtime, but that's fine. That's worth it. If you don't have Bloodlust, then it's going to be a little different. If you get good crit RNG, you can go for the bite. Regardless of what happens, you're probably going to cause a small rip downtime. If you get bad crit RNG, then or just the timing doesn't work out that well, you probably want to forsake the bite entirely. Just get the 2 bites and then refresh the rip when it gets down to like 7 seconds. And the key to this is that this assumes that you've got trinket procs up still at that point. If you can Ferocious Bite a 3rd time, but you don't have trinket procs up, you're going to have your pre-pot up. But if you don't have your trinket procs up, then you're not really gaining that much. The idea is you want to milk those trinket procs in the last couple seconds they're up, and then refresh the rip later after, since it doesn't benefit from the trinket procs anymore at that point. Since it's still ticking, it's going to be ticking throughout your whole trinket procs just from the first rip. So that's that idea. As far as what's different with the other 2 talents, of course, if you're doing Claws of Shivala, you don't need to cast Healing Touch. It goes without saying. But the other thing that's going to be different is your Rake Refresh is going to be in a little bit different of a spot. So that Rake, instead of being before your Ferocious Bite, because you're waiting to get that Blood Talons onto it, you can do it immediately after the rip, because your first Rake is only going to be benefiting from improved Rake, so it does double damage. But then you've got Incarnation up, and then you Tiger's Fury'd, then it's going to be benefiting from improved Rake and Tiger's Fury. So after you rip, so you don't waste combo points, you rip, and then you put the new Rake up, and so it'll do 15% more damage. That's Claws of Shivala. That's the only difference. Obviously, it doesn't really add anything to the opener. It's just a damage boost. And then the same goes for Lunar Inspiration. You want to move your Rake to right after the rip to get that 50% benefit right away. Now, obviously, with Lunar Inspiration, you've got a second dot. So the way you're going to want to manage that is after you apply the Rake, you put up Moonfire immediately before the Incarnation, because it doesn't get any benefit from Incarnation. And then it's going to be up for a while. 14 seconds is a pretty good time. You're going to have to refresh it between your first and second bites, or sometime after your second bite, or something like that. I don't remember the exact timing at the moment, but whenever it gets to below 4.2 seconds, you refresh it, no problem. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over just a little demo on opener as Blood Talons. I'm not going to try to narrate everything because it's pretty fast. It's hard to comment on everything what I'm doing, but basically the list is here on the right side. You can see what I'll be trying to do. Alright, so pull timer starts. I cast my pre-healing touch, get in the cat form Prowl. Tank's getting ready to pull. Oh, my Prowl is on cooldown. You gotta be careful with that, of course. So I get into Prowl. Tank's getting ready to pull, so I pre-pot and then Rake, and then here we go. Pre-pot, Rake. Get my second bite off, and here's where you're like, okay, do I go for the second bite here? I'm definitely going to go for the second bite, because my rip isn't even close to 7 seconds yet. And then here you see, this is where you kind of relying on RNG to see if you can get that rip up without too much downtime. So I got the rip back up. That's essentially the opener. At this point, you're going back into your normal rotation. So that's all I got for the basic rotation video. If you have any interest in seeing a little bit more feral gameplay, you're not sure how to do things, I'll add a link into the description below, as well as an annotation to my heroic Mar'gok kill with my guild, and you can check out how I'm handling the sustained damage on the boss, and maybe even the ads and the intermissions if you want to see that sort of thing. So check that out if that's something that interests you. Also, as always, I'll have the link to my written guide below in the description as well, so if you're not sure on something, you can check that out, reference that see if you can find the answer to your question, or you can post below in the comments with your question, and I'll answer it there. As always, thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, that sort of thing, yada yada, and I'll see you later.